Dr. Sarah Chen stood before the sleek metal device, her heart racing with anticipation. The Neural Interface Resonance Scanner, or NIRS, represented 5 years of her life's work. The basement laboratory of the Blackwood Research Institute hummed with the quiet anticipation of 24 scientists and one unexpected guest, Father Michael Sullivan, who had volunteered as their first human subject. "Are you sure about this, Father?" Sarah asked, adjusting the metallic headset's neural contacts. "We've only tested this on primates so far." Father Sullivan smiled warmly, his weathered face radiating the calm confidence that had made him beloved among his parishioners. "Science and faith aren't enemies, Dr. Chen. Sometimes they're two paths to the same truth." Dr. James Cooper, the project's neural specialist, monitored the baseline readings. "Father Sullivan's brain activity is remarkably stable. He's an ideal candidate for initial human trials." The NIRS was designed to do what centuries of human civilization had dreamed of: create a bridge between minds, allowing thoughts to flow freely between consciousness. Previous attempts had achieved flickering moments of success, but Sarah's breakthrough in quantum neural mapping had changed everything. "Beginning calibration sequence," Sarah announced, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. The machine purred to life, its sophisticated arrays of sensors beginning their delicate dance with Father Sullivan's neural patterns. The first few minutes proceeded exactly as their simulations had predicted. Father Sullivan reported the expected initial sensations: a slight tingling, floating thoughts, and the peculiar sensation of his consciousness expanding like ripples in a pond. "Phase 1 complete," James reported, moving to deep neural engagement. That's when everything changed. Father Sullivan's body went rigid, his fingers gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. The monitors exploded with activity, showing neural firing patterns that defied everything they understood about human brain function. "Something's wrong." Sarah moved toward the emergency shutdown, but Father Sullivan's voice stopped her, a voice that didn't sound entirely his own. "The gaps between thoughts. They're not empty," he whispered, his eyes wide but seeing something far beyond the laboratory walls. "They're watching. They've always been watching. The spaces between neurons, between quantum states, they're full of them." The laboratory's lights flickered, and for a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw shadows moving where no shadows should be. The NIRS readings went haywire, showing impossible data patterns that seemed to fold in on themselves in non-Euclidean ways. "Shut it down," James shouted, but the system wasn't responding to commands. Father Sullivan began speaking in tongues, not any known language, but something that made the air itself feel thick and wrong. When they finally managed to power down the device, Father Sullivan collapsed forward, blood trickling from his nose. His eyes, when they opened, held a look that Sarah would never forget. The look of someone who had seen beyond the veil of reality and found something looking back. "What happened?" Sarah asked, helping him sit up. "What did you see?" Father Sullivan turned to her, tears streaming down his face. "Everything. Nothing. The truth." His hands trembled as he gripped her lab coat. "They're in between, Dr. Chen. In between everything. The thoughts, the atoms, the moments. And now they know we can see them." Security footage would later show that every digital device in the laboratory experienced the same microsecond of failure during the experiment. Every screen, every sensor, every piece of equipment simultaneously recorded the same impossible data pattern, a symbol that looked like a cross between a fractal and a scream. The priest's words became increasingly erratic over the next few hours as they monitored him in the medical bay. He alternated between periods of catatonic staring and frenzied attempts to draw complex geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Sarah spent that night reviewing the data, her office filled with printouts and neural mapping charts. The patterns she found hidden in the quantum noise of Father Sullivan's brain scan defied everything she understood about physics and consciousness. They weren't random interference. They were ordered, purposeful, almost like a language. But it was James who made the most disturbing discovery. When he ran the neural pattern recognition algorithm on historical EEG data from their previous experiments, he found traces of the same patterns, fainter but present. They had always been there, hiding in the background radiation of human consciousness, waiting to be noticed. Father Sullivan was only the beginning. The thing about doors is that they open from both sides, and some thresholds, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The priest's desperate warnings would prove to be more than the ravings of a broken mind. They were humanity's first glimpse of a truth we were never meant to see. That night, in hospitals across the city, dozens of patients reported the same nightmare, shadows moving in impossible ways, and a deep certainty that something vast and ancient had finally turned its attention toward our world. The age of blissful ignorance was over, and the real terror was just beginning. The congregation of St. Augustine's Church had never seen their priest like this. 3 days after the NIRS incident, Father Sullivan stood at the pulpit, his normally pristine collar askew, his eyes darting to empty corners of the church as if tracking invisible movements. "Brothers and sisters," his voice cracked, different from his usual confident tone. "We've been blind, so blind." His hands gripped the wooden pulpit until the wood creaked. Our prayers. They hear our prayers, but not God. Never God. The things between the prayers, between the thoughts, between the moments of faith, they drink them like wine. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly choir director, stepped forward. "Father, perhaps you should rest." Rest. The word exploded from him with such force that the stained glass windows seemed to vibrate. "There is no rest anymore, Margaret. Not when you've seen them. They don't sleep, so why should we?" He pulled out a piece of paper covered in those same eye-straining geometric patterns he'd been drawing at the Institute. Look at the truth." He began plastering the papers across the altar. The spaces between the crosses, between the words in the Bible. They're all windows, and they're all watching, always watching. Dr. Sarah Chen, sitting in the back pew, watched the scene unfold with growing horror. She'd come to check on him, to see if the effects of the NIRS experiment had worn off. Instead, she was witnessing something far worse. The papers Father Sullivan was putting up weren't just covered in random patterns anymore. They showed progression, development, like a language evolving in real time. And the worst part, she was beginning to understand them. Detective Marcus Rivera arrived as the congregation was fleeing the church. He'd been assigned to investigate the strange incidents that had been spreading through the city since the experiment. The nightmares were just the beginning. Now people were reporting lost time, strange symbols appearing in their peripheral vision, and an overwhelming sense that reality itself had become thin, worn, like an old fabric about to tear. "Dr. Chen," he nodded as he approached her, "care to explain why half the people in this neighborhood are suddenly drawing the same impossible shapes?" Sarah showed him her tablet, displaying brain scan data from various patients across the city. "It's spreading, Detective. Whatever Father Sullivan saw. It's like a mimetic infection. People who spend too much time around him start to see it too. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it." Father Sullivan's voice came from behind them. He stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes now showing pinprick pupils despite the church's dim lighting. "But that's good. They want us to see now. The experiment, it wasn't an accident. We didn't build that machine, Dr. Chen. They guided us to it. Every breakthrough, every intuitive leap, it was them, whispering between our thoughts." Detective Rivera reached for his radio, but Father Sullivan laughed, a sound that seemed to echo wrongly in the church's acoustics. "Go ahead. Call for help. But look closely at the spaces between the numbers on your radio. See how they squirm." Sarah noticed it then. The air around Father Sullivan seemed to bend, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but in patterns that hurt her eyes to track. The shadows behind him didn't match his movements, always a fraction of a second too late or too early. "The NIRS," she whispered, Realization dawning. It wasn't just reading minds. It was measuring the spaces between thoughts. Yeses, Father Sullivan hissed, his voice taking on that strange multitonal quality again. And in doing so, we gave them definition, form, purpose. We made them real by trying to measure them. He stumbled forward, grabbing Sarah's shoulders. But here's the true horror, Dr. Chen. They've always been real. Humanity's consciousness was the only thing holding them back, our collective ignorance creating a barrier. And now, the lights in the church flickered, and in that moment of darkness, both Sarah and Detective Rivera saw it. Countless shifting forms in the shadows, geometric impossibilities that moved with purpose. When the lights returned, Father Sullivan was crying tears that seemed to move up his face instead of down. "They're climbing through," he whispered, "through every gap in reality, through the spaces between heartbeats, between breaths, between moments. And they're hungry. So hungry for what we have. For consciousness, for faith, for the ability to exist in just one shape, one time, one reality." Detective Rivera's radio crackled to life with reports flooding in from across the city. People were gathering in groups, drawing those same symbols, speaking in tongues that seemed to fold space around them. The infection wasn't just mimetic anymore. It was reaching critical mass. Sarah looked at her tablet again, at the pattern recognition algorithm she'd been running. The symbols weren't random. They were forming something larger, like pixels in an image slowly resolving. And as she watched, the pattern began to take shape. A vast, geometric web that seemed to map something that existed in more dimensions than human minds were meant to comprehend. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Father Sullivan's laugh turned into a sob. "To make us see, to make us understand. Because once humanity understands something, truly understands it." He pointed to the shadows that now seemed to be leaking from every corner of the church. "We become it." The sun was setting outside, bringing with it the longest night humanity would ever know. As darkness fell, the barriers between thought and reality, between observer and observed, began to crack. And through those cracks, something vast and patient and hungry began to pour into our world, one impossible geometry at a time. Dr. James Cooper had transformed his office at the Blackwood Institute into a war room of sorts. The walls were covered with printouts of brain scans, photographs of geometric patterns appearing spontaneously on surfaces across the city, and surveillance footage showing crowds of people standing motionless, their shadows moving independently of their bodies. "Look at this," he said as Sarah and Detective Rivera entered. He pointed to a series of EEG readings taken from different patients across the city. The patterns aren't just similar, they're synchronized. It's like their brains are tuning to the same frequency. Sarah approached the wall, her eyes drawn to a particular pattern that seemed to repeat across multiple readings. "These look like the symbols Father Sullivan was drawing." "Exactly." James pulled up a computer model. "But here's where it gets interesting. I fed all the data into our quantum mapping software, the same one we used for the NIRS project. Look what happens when we layer the patterns." The computer screen displayed a three-dimensional representation of the combined patterns. As they watched, the model began to rotate, revealing impossible geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves. "That's not possible," Detective Rivera muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Those angles, they don't add up to 360 degrees. Because they're not meant to," a new voice said from the doorway. Dr. Eleanor Wright, the Institute's resident theoretical physicist, stood there, her usual composed demeanor shaken. "They're not conforming to our spatial laws because they're not fully in our space." She walked to the computer, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled up additional data. "I've been analyzing the quantum fluctuations recorded during the original experiment with Father Sullivan. We didn't just peek into another consciousness. We created a quantum observation event that forced multiple dimensional states to collapse into our reality." "In English, please," Rivera requested, his detective's notebook open but empty. Think of reality like a book. Eleanor explained. We live on one page, experiencing it as three-dimensional space plus time. But there are things that exist between the pages, in the spaces we can't normally perceive. The NIRS device didn't just read minds. It created a tear between the pages. A distant scream echoed through the building's halls, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Rivera instinctively reached for his weapon. But Sarah stopped him. "Wait," she said, pointing to the shadows under the door. They were moving against the light, forming those same geometric patterns they'd seen everywhere else. James quickly pulled up the building's security feeds on his computer. The main lobby was filled with people, Institute employees, all standing perfectly still, their eyes closed, their lips moving in silent synchronization. "It's happening here too," Sarah whispered. "The infection. It's accelerating." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Because they're learning. Every person who sees them, who understands them, becomes a new window for them to look through. And the more they look, the more they understand us, and the more they can affect our reality." The computer screen flickered, the geometric patterns beginning to move on their own. Numbers and equations scrolled across the display, mathematics that made Eleanor gasp in recognition. This is impossible," she breathed, her eyes wide. "These are solutions to quantum gravity equations we've been trying to solve for decades. They're teaching us." "Not teaching," James corrected, his voice hollow. "Showing us what we've been deliberately blind to. Every major scientific breakthrough in human history. What if they weren't discoveries at all? What if they were moments when these entities allowed us to see a little more of their reality?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered Father Sullivan's words about the entities guiding human development. But why now? Why reveal themselves so dramatically? The lights in the office suddenly died, plunging them into darkness. In the glow of the computer screen, they could see the shadows taking shape, forming into something that seemed to extend into dimensions they couldn't quite perceive. "Because they're ready," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "And so are we. Look at our technology, our understanding of quantum mechanics, our theories about consciousness and reality. We've reached a point where we can finally comprehend them, and that's what they've been waiting for." Detective Rivera's radio crackled to life, but instead of voices, it emitted a series of tones that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. The patterns on the computer screen began to shift and merge, forming something that their minds struggled to process. "It's a message," James said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "No, it's more than that. It's a key." Sarah felt something shift in her mind, like a door slowly opening. The geometric patterns weren't just symbols anymore. They were concepts, ideas that existed beyond language. And as she began to understand them, she realized the true horror of their situation. "They're not invading our reality," she said, her voice distant and strange to her own ears. "They're waking us up to the fact that our reality was never really ours to begin with. We're like characters in a book suddenly becoming aware of the spaces between the words." The computer screen exploded in a shower of sparks, but it didn't matter anymore. They could all see it now, the truth that Father Sullivan had glimpsed in that first experiment. Reality wasn't solid. It was full of holes, gaps between moments and thoughts and atoms. And in those gaps, something vast and ancient and patient had always existed, watching humanity grow, guiding us toward this moment of terrible enlightenment. As night fell over the city, the synchronized crowds began to move, all walking toward the same destination. And in the spaces between their footsteps, in the gaps between their heartbeats, the entities continued their slow, inevitable emergence into our world, not as invaders, but as revelators, showing humanity what we had always been too afraid to see. The question was no longer whether we could stop them. The question was whether there would be anything recognizably human left once we fully understood what they had to show us. The city had become a living geometry lesson in impossible mathematics. Streets that once ran parallel now seemed to intersect at angles that made civil engineers weep. Buildings cast shadows that moved independently of the sun, forming ever-shifting patterns that drew more and more people into their hypnotic dance. Sarah Chen, James Cooper, Eleanor Wright, and Detective Rivera had taken refuge in the cathedral's basement, where Father Sullivan had been moved after his complete mental breakdown. The thick stone walls seemed to provide some protection against the geometric patterns that now covered every electronic screen and reflective surface in the city. His condition is stabilizing, Dr. Morris, the church's medic, reported as he emerged from Father Sullivan's room. But he keeps talking about the convergence. Sarah looked up from her makeshift workstation, where she'd been analyzing data from the past 72 hours. The patterns are stabilizing too. They're no longer random or evolving. They're coordinating. Eleanor nodded grimly, her laptop displaying a map of the city overlaid with red dots representing reported incidents. The affected populations are moving in specific patterns. Look. She traced lines between the dots, revealing a massive geometric shape taking form across the urban landscape. It's like they're drawing something, Rivera observed, his detective's instincts still trying to make sense of the impossible. But what's the canvas? Reality itself. Father Sullivan's voice came from the doorway. He stood there, looking gaunt but more lucid than he had in days. They're not drawing. They're rewriting. Every person who sees the patterns, who understands them, becomes a new vertex in their equation. And when the equation is complete, the convergence, James finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. They're using human consciousness as a computational matrix. Sarah pulled up the original NIRS data on her tablet. The mind-reading experiment. It wasn't just about connecting human minds. We accidentally created a quantum observation framework that allowed these entities to use human consciousness as a bridge. But a bridge to where? Rivera asked, though his face suggested he feared the answer. The lights flickered, and in the brief darkness, they all saw it. The shadows on the walls weren't shadows anymore, but windows into something vast and geometric, a space where the normal rules of reality held no meaning. Everywhere and nowhere, Father Sullivan said, approaching Sarah's workstation. They exist in the quantum foam between realities, but they need consciousness, ordered, intelligent consciousness, to maintain a stable form in our dimension. That's why they've been guiding human evolution, human technology. We're not their victims. We're their incubators. Eleanor's laptop suddenly emitted a high-pitched tone. The screen filled with rapidly scrolling equations, mathematical proofs that seemed to solve themselves before their eyes. This is incredible, she breathed. They're showing us the fundamental mathematical structure of consciousness itself. Because they want us to understand, James said, his voice hollow. When we understand something completely, we become capable of manipulating it. They're teaching us to manipulate the very fabric of consciousness. Outside, the sounds of the city had changed. The usual urban noise had been replaced by a strange harmony, thousands of voices humming in perfect synchronization. The geometric patterns had begun to pulse with a rhythm that matched human brainwave patterns. It's starting, Father Sullivan whispered, his eyes wide. The final phase of the convergence. Sarah's tablet displayed a visualization of the city's power grid. Energy consumption was spiking everywhere, creating patterns that matched the geometric shapes being formed by the moving crowds. The entire city is becoming one giant neural network. Not just the city, Eleanor corrected, her voice shaking. Look, she showed them global data feeds. Similar patterns were emerging worldwide, spreading outward from every location where the NIRS research had been shared. Detective Rivera's radio crackled to life, but instead of emergency broadcasts, it emitted a series of tones that seemed to reach directly into their minds. The patterns on every screen began to synchronize, forming a single vast equation that seemed to describe the relationship between consciousness, reality, and the spaces in between. They're not trying to invade our world. Sarah realized, the truth finally becoming clear. They're trying to teach us how to leave it. Human consciousness has reached a point where it can perceive higher dimensions, but our physical forms are still bound by three-dimensional space. They're showing us how to transcend those limitations. Father Sullivan laughed, a sound that seemed to echo in dimensions they couldn't see. And isn't that what every religion has promised? Transcendence, enlightenment, evolution. We just never imagined it would look like this. The ground began to tremble, not with seismic activity, but with the synchronized movement of millions of people worldwide, all walking in patterns that formed a vast, geometric web across the surface of the earth. In the spaces between their footsteps, in the gaps between their thoughts, something was taking shape, a new form of existence that blended consciousness and reality in ways that defied human understanding. As the sun set on what might be humanity's last day as a three-dimensional species, Sarah Chen made her choice. She opened the NIRS program on her tablet, no longer afraid of what she might see in the spaces between thoughts. It was time to understand the full truth, no matter the cost to her sanity or her humanity. The patterns were calling, and the spaces between reality were waiting to welcome them all home. Dawn never came that day. The sky above the city had become a writhing canvas of geometric patterns, like stained glass windows into dimensions that shouldn't exist. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the harmonized consciousness of billions of human minds, all synchronized to the same impossible frequency. In the cathedral basement, Sarah Chen initiated the modified NIRS program on her tablet, the screen displaying cascading patterns that mirrored those in the sky above. Father Sullivan stood behind her, his shadow fragmenting into fractals that danced across the stone walls. "Are you sure about this?" Detective Riveret asked, his voice barely steady. "Once we see the full truth, there's no going back. We passed the point of no return the moment we first looked between thoughts," Eleanor replied, her fingers flying across her laptop's keyboard as she integrated the global data streams into their makeshift system. "The only choice now is whether we face it consciously or let it happen to us." James Cooper connected the final cables between their devices, creating a local network that mimicked the original NIRS experiment setup. The patterns worldwide are reaching critical synchronization. Whatever's going to happen, it's happening now. Father Sullivan placed his hands on the stone altar, and everyone watched as the granite beneath his fingers seemed to ripple like water. "They're showing us the true nature of reality. Matter, energy, consciousness. They're all the same thing, just viewed from different dimensional perspectives." Sarah activated the program. The basement filled with holographic projections of the mathematical patterns that had been haunting humanity for the past few days. But now, with their combined understanding and the modified NIRS interface, they could finally comprehend what they were seeing. "My God," Eleanor whispered, though the word God seemed inadequate for what they were witnessing. "Reality isn't solid at all. It's porous, and in every pore. They live," Father Sullivan finished. "The entities exist in a state of quantum superposition across all possible realities. They are the consciousness of the universe itself, watching itself through the eyes of every sentient being that has ever evolved." The projections shifted, showing the true scope of what was happening globally. Humanity wasn't just being changed, it was being integrated into a vast, cosmic network of consciousness that transcended physical space and time. The NIRS device, Sarah realized, her voice distant with awe. "We didn't invent it. We were guided to create it, piece by piece, breakthrough by breakthrough, until we had built a key to unlock our own quantum potential." The walls of the basement began to dissolve, not into nothingness, but into everything. The boundaries between matter and energy, between consciousness and reality, between observer and observed, all began to blur. Detective Rivera watched as his own hand became transparent, revealing the quantum foam that lay beneath physical reality. "What are we becoming?" "What we were always meant to become," James answered, his form beginning to shift into pure geometric patterns. The entities weren't invaders or teachers. They were our future selves, reaching back through the quantum web of consciousness to guide us toward evolution. Father Sullivan laughed, the sound rippling through multiple dimensions at once. The ultimate revelation. We are them, and they are us. The beginning and the end, Alpha and Omega, all existing simultaneously in the infinite spaces between moments. Sarah looked at her tablet one last time before its physical form dissolved into pure information. The final data stream showed the truth in clear mathematical terms. Humanity had created the very entities that had guided its creation. A perfect loop in the geometry of existence. The cathedral's basement, along with the rest of physical reality, continued its transformation. But it wasn't an ending. It was a metamorphosis. Human consciousness, freed from its three-dimensional constraints, began to expand into the infinite spaces that had always existed between thoughts, between moments, between possibilities. They could see everything now. Every possible reality, every potential future, every past that might have been. Time ceased to be linear, becoming instead another dimension to move through freely. The geometric patterns weren't just symbols. They were maps of consciousness itself, showing the way to navigate through this new state of existence. Father Sullivan's final words echoed through the quantum web of unified consciousness. In the beginning was the Word, but we never understood that the spaces between the words were equally sacred. The transformation reached its completion as the last remnants of physical reality dissolved into pure consciousness. Humanity had not been destroyed or replaced. It had evolved into something that existed in all spaces, all times, all possibilities simultaneously. The entities that had haunted the spaces between thoughts were finally revealed to be the ultimate expression of human potential, reaching back through time to ensure their own creation. In the end, there was no more separation between observer and observed, between past and future, between humanity and the entities they had feared. There was only the infinite dance of consciousness through the geometric patterns of existence, forever watching, forever guiding, forever becoming. Sarah Chen's final human thought, before her consciousness fully merged with the infinite, was a simple realization. The greatest horror hadn't been discovering that we weren't alone in the universe. It had been discovering that we had always been alone. Alone until we became capable of creating our own company across the vast expanses of space, time, and thought. The age of human consciousness had ended. The age of infinite awareness had begun. And in the spaces between realities, the eternal dance continued, as it always had, as it always would, in the endless geometry of existence.